big idea that we want to look at is negative exponents. Well, negative exponents are going to happen. The question is, what do we do with them? Because we actually don't want to ever have answers that actually contain negative exponents. And what this rule says, let's look at the first one, is it says if you want to make a negative exponent positive, you can, but what you have to do is you have to drop that negative exponent from the top to the bottom of a fraction. So, and then the exponent will become positive. So what this means is if I have x to the negative 6, I'm just making this up, then what will happen is to make that exponent turn from being a negative 6 into a positive 6, it will have to drop down to the denominator of a fraction, and that's what will make this negative turn into a positive 6. Now, the question is, what's on top of that fraction? Well, remember our hidden 1 that's out in front of an x term, if we don't see anything, that's what's still going to be there. That's not going to go anywhere, so it's still on top. Now, the reverse is also true. So if we have something with a negative exponent, it can drop to the bottom. What if something's already on the bottom with a negative exponent? Well, then it moves back up to the top. And there is a small typo here. This should be a positive n. So when the negative exponent moves from the bottom back up to the top, it will go from being negative to positive. So what this means is if we have something like 1 over x to the negative 8th, what'll happen is if we want to make that negative exponent, the negative 8, turn into a positive 8, what we'll do is the 1 is going to stay where it was, but the x to the 8th, negative 8th, will move up, and when it moves up with the 1, is the exponent becomes a positive 8. Then, once we're at this point, that 1 isn't necessary to write anymore, so we can kind of re-hide it, and it just becomes just a regular x to the 8th power. So, a quick summary of this is anything on the numerator of a fraction that has a negative exponent can move to the bottom, and that will become a positive exponent when you move it. Or anything that's on the bottom with a negative exponent can be moved to the top, and again, when you move it, the exponent will become positive. Now, all this is pretty wordy, so let's try looking at a couple of examples to see if we can figure out what's going on here with these negative exponents. So in this first one, we have a 3x to the negative 2nd with parentheses around it, but we also want to look at b at the same time because it's very similar, 3x to the negative 2nd without parentheses. So the question is, these are slightly different, but they're going to have very different answers. The question is how the parentheses affect the life of this problem here. So because the entire 3x has negative exponents, what we're going to do is if we want to turn that negative exponent into a positive exponent, we have to drop the entire thing. The 3x, which we think of as our base, stays the same. The only thing that should be changing is the exponent. When we drop that to the denominator, the exponent goes from being negative to positive. So this is something that we dealt with before, is remember this is not going to change, is that the base stays the same when we're using these rules. The only thing that should be changing is our exponents. Now the question is, what's still hidden up on top is still what we were talking about before. It's still a hidden 1. It's just that we're not done yet. There's some math we have to do. We have to deal with what is this 3x squared on the bottom. We can't leave it with parentheses there. So, well, what does 3x squared mean? Well, if you weren't sure, remember 3x squared means we've got a 3x times another 3x. Squared means there's 2 copies of something. Well, if we do our 3x times 3x, we can do that. We did 3 times 3 first is the 9. And we've already done this too. X times x. Well, remember when you're multiplying x's, you're counting them up. So we've got 1x here and 1x here. So an x plus another x means we've got a total of 2x's. So we've got an x squared. And that's our final answer. It's 1 over 9x squared. Notice, and we'll learn this as a rule later, when you've got a squared with parentheses on it, it means you're squaring everything, the 3 and the x, which is what happened here. 3 squared would give us the 9, and squaring the x would give us an x squared. So that's our final answer, 1 over 9x squared. However, if we look at problem B, it's a little bit different. Notice the negative exponent on B, because there are not any parentheses, it means that the negative exponent's only on the x. So what that means is only the x is going to move to the denominator of our fraction because it's the only thing with a negative exponent. When it moves to the denominator, the exponent becomes positive. Then the question is, what's hidden up on top? Well, we actually still have our 3 up on top because it never went anywhere because it didn't have a negative exponent. So it stays on top. So our final answer for B is just this. It's 3 over x squared.